For the next few moments, I'm going to share with you when God makes a king his servant, a very, very interesting study. You know, the evangelical community of which I'm a part of is quite humorous, because I remember when Mitt Romney ran for president, a very good moral man with great moral values, biblical values, but he was a Mormon. And many of the evangelicals teach that Mormonism is a cult. I don't believe in the Book of Mormon, by the way. I believe it was a hoax, but the man himself was a moral man. But literally hundreds of thousands of Christians refused to vote because they did not want a Mormon in as president. Well, we see what's happened since then. We saw what the laws that have been passed, the breaking the law of traditional marriage, the covenant of marriage that the Supreme Court just pretty much abolished, a 6,000-year-old rule that God had, and made their own decision to change that covenant. And we saw what happened as a result of having certain people in. Evangelicals are, I don't know, I can't figure them out, because they act like that every election year they're electing a pastor in the White House. And if that pastor does not agree with everything they say, I'm voting him out. And they don't understand that we're not electing a pastor. We are trying to elect a civil leader who best would represent the Christian faith or the concepts and precepts of the Bible. I think if we're waiting for, first of all, if we had the type of Christian that we evangelicals want in, he'd probably only get 20% of the vote and never have a chance, because the majority of the American people just do not believe what evangelicals believe. That's sad, because most evangelicals believe what the Bible teaches, the majority of them do, but that's where the American public is ignorant of the Bible. Well, maybe I rambled on a little bit there, but I often hear people say, well, I won't vote for the lesser of two evils, or if they're not a Christian, I'm not voting for them, or they've got a bad mouth and I can't handle that. And we could go on and on with everybody's excuses. So I'm going to share something with you from the scripture of how God can view a person, because God knows the future of that person and not the present. I want to talk about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, set an invasion into Israel. He invaded Israel, he invaded Judea, then he invaded Jerusalem. When he invaded Jerusalem, he burnt the temple to the ground, and prior to that took all the gold treasures out, took the gold treasures as his spoil to Babylon, and he also captured the Jewish people, a large percentage of them from Judea, took them in slavery in the area of Babylon, and it was there, they were there for 70 years. Now, here's what God says. I want everybody to listen carefully, because when I think of Nebuchadnezzar, I think of a wicked man, a pagan man, an idol worshiper. I think of a guy that is destroying Jerusalem, a guy that takes the temple treasures, who's got the Jews in chains. He cannot be a friend of God's. There's nothing good about this man. There's nothing good about him, I tell you. Here's what God says about him in Jeremiah 25:9. Behold, I will send and take all the families of the north, saith the Lord, and Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, Nebuchadnezzar, my servant, bring them into this land, and against this inhabitants thereof, and against all the nations round about, and utterly destroy them, and make them an astonishment, hissing, and a desolation. Now, two times in Jeremiah chapter 25 and verse 9, and Jeremiah 27 verse 6, God declares Nebuchadnezzar, this king of Babylon, this pagan, ready, I quote, my servant. God calls Nebuchadnezzar my servant, and he's about to destroy Jerusalem, take the Jews captive, and steal the articles of the temple. This makes no sense whatsoever. However, the phrase my servant in Hebrew is the exact same phrase when God says my servant David, my servant Moses, and when God begins to call my servant Jacob. So what does it mean that God looks at Nebuchadnezzar and calls him my servant, and he's about to do something bad? Well, pardon me. First of all, God calls him my servant because he's going to fulfill a prophecy that's 150 years old, and is going to fulfill all the prophecies that Jeremiah said that the king of Babylon is coming to destroy the city. He's God's servant in the sense of he's about to fulfill prophecy that was given about him. Number two, he is called God's servant because, listen carefully, God did not see him for what he saw at that moment. He saw what he was to be in the future. Do you realize that God calls those things that be not as though they already were? Christ is called the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. It was 4,000 years from the creation of Adam till the crucifixion of Jesus, yet God said he's already slain as far as I'm concerned, because God knew in the future Christ would do it, so he can call it done before it's happened. And I hope that makes sense to you. So here's the thing about Nebuchadnezzar. He did one right thing. When he came in and he brought all the Jewish captives to Babylon, he took Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel, and he brought them into the palace. Now, these are 4 Jewish young men who are probably in their late teens or early 20s, 4 Jewish young men who are in covenant with God, 4 Jewish young men who will not compromise at the king's table, 4 Jewish young men who will not drink the king's wine, who will not eat from the meat sacrificed to idols, and who stand up for righteousness in the middle of the White House. Oh, I'm sorry, the king's palace. Watch the parallel here. Now, because Nebuchadnezzar surrounded himself with these young men, the first couple of years were rough. I mean, they threw Daniel in the lions, and of course the Persians did that. That's another story. But the 3 Hebrew boys had to go in the fiery furnace for not bowing down to an idol. However, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that Daniel interprets it, and he has a 7-year nervous breakdown. After the breakdown, now remember, God says in Daniel 4:17, I'll let you read this later, that this breakdown that Nebuchadnezzar is about to have is a decree from the angels. The Hebrew word here is watchers. The decree of the watchers, and it's the word to the intent of the holy ones. In other words, the people of God were praying for this man, and God was going to use a nervous breakdown to get his attention. After Nebuchadnezzar had the 7-year nervous breakdown and turned into a wild man, watch what happens when he comes out of the breakdown. This is in the book of Daniel 4. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are true, and his ways justice, and those that walk in pride he is able to abase. So Nebuchadnezzar says this, look, God is able to humble someone, including myself. And he says, I want to praise the God of heaven. Now, the fact was this, because Nebuchadnezzar surrounded himself with the right people, it eventually changed his heart. God eventually stepped in through circumstances and made the man a believer in the God of the Jews. And God calls him my servant before he is ever officially God's servant. He calls him his servant when he's about to do something crazy. This shows me that God looks at the heart of a person and sees things that you and I do not. We judge people by the press, by the words they said in the past. We judge people by everybody's opinion. God does not do that. God sees 8 years down the road, and he says, I can use this person because I can change their heart. God cannot use a hard-hearted person, a stubborn person, or a person whose mind is made up. But if people will allow the right people to surround them, God can change their heart from what they are now to what he wants them to be in the future. This is very important when you consider what you see in people now, but what God sees in them down the road. Let me give you an example. President Reagan had Jerry Falwell, Billy Graham, and also at that time men like Jimmy Swaggart, who he was talking to consistently about spiritual things. Ronald Reagan consulted Jack Van Impe before the wall fell, the Berlin Wall fell, and when communism began to fall, to see if it was in Bible prophecy. A lot of people don't know that, but Jack told me that himself. President Clinton, despite all his weaknesses, he allowed Pentecostals to come to the White House to do music and singing, and a lot of Baptist pastors from Arkansas to come to the White House. Bush had, President George W. Bush had several key ministers that visited him consistently, prayed for him. President Obama, I'm honest with you, I've not heard a report of any particular minister that he has in the White House. I know he has all the Muslim leaders in during Ramadan. I don't know about Christians during 8 years. Hillary Clinton, I have heard nothing from the inside about how many preachers she consults with or talks to. I do know 20 media outlets are with her, 100%. She has an inner circle of very secular people. Candidate Trump, I know for a fact, has 1,000 preachers on a committee who speak to him that he meets with. Some are actually flying up privately and meeting with him. And I'm not going to say anything about that because that's not my business to talk about who these men are and what they're talking about. So my point is simply this. You've got to consider what God sees in a person that you don't see. You've got to consider the ability of God to change a person's heart and the ability of a person to surround themselves with people who can speak into their life and influence them in a positive manner. This is very, very significant when you consider who will lead a state, who will lead your city, and who will lead the next president of the United States, whoever that may be. Consider these things at this time. Stay tuned for number 4 that I'm going to be sharing with you here in just a moment, which is my final teaching on this subject. Why is there such a battle every election year?